Hades, a Greek gods and goddesses paranormal romance, Guardians of Hades Romance Series Book 9, written by Felicity Heaton, narrated by Troy Duran and Devin Grace. Chapter 1. A shaft of light sliced through the darkness. Fragile, dim, the only light in this darkening world. The Underworld. His realm, his home. The lands he would do anything to protect, upholding his sacred vow and crushing any who dared rise against him, who dared target the souls under his care, who dared target his family. Hades' heart beat slowly, evenly, controlled. His breaths were steady, a contrast to the desperate, fearful panting of the female on her knees before him in the windowless black room in the heart of his prison, Tartarus, a place where she had been many times in the last few months. Hades tightened his fists until his bones creaked under the intense pressure. A place where she belonged. He stared down at her, his face impassive, his emotions in check. For only a fool would allow an enemy to see such weakness. And Hades was no fool. Millennia of ruling the underworld had taught him many lessons, but none more essential than this one. Never reveal a weakness to an enemy, for they would always exploit it. And for that reason, the goddess kneeling before him, her raven braids matted with filth, her black skirt ripped to reveal dirty, scarred skin, and a narrow strip of fabric binding her breasts, had seen nothing but this cold mask he wore in all the times he had dragged her from her cell. He had mistakenly revealed his weakness to his enemy, and they had exploited it, had targeted not just his beloved realm, but his family, had stolen his daughter from his cherished wife, from him, for centuries, making them believe she was dead, gone, lost to them forever. A piece of his heart he thought he would never get back. For that alone, he would have visited Eris to torture her daily for the rest of time. But the goddess had desperately confessed she'd had no part in Calendria's false death and the subsequent imprisonment. Eris had begged, pleaded, beseeched him as his shadows had torn into her, lancing her flesh and spilling her blood across the cracked black ground. Oh, how the little goddess of strife had screamed. Pleasure flitted through him, brief and fleeting, and neither of the other two occupants of the interrogation room saw it. One, because the male was staring at the wretch before Hades as he was. The other because her head slumped forwards, as if it had become too heavy for her to hold up. Her ragged breath stirred the copper-drenched air. Fresh blood slid down her hunched shoulders, seeping from 8 puncture marks across her back. One for each of his children. She croaked, her voice hoarse from screaming, and coughed to clear her throat. Her voice was faint, pathetic, when she managed to speak again. My God, King. 100 needle-like shadows exploded from the black ground and stabbed her as rage burned up his blood, disgust swift to roll through him. And as she cried out, her body bowing backwards and chest arching towards the pale light that filtered down onto her, he had to grind his teeth to stop himself from thundering his words at her. Dare, he snarled instead, the single word making the ground beneath his pointed black metal boots quake. He lowered his voice to a fierce hiss. Dare speak of me as your king, impudent filth. You serve another, and I will know her location. You will tell me. As the last of her breath left her on a broken scream, Eris slumped forwards again, further this time, so her brow kissed the blood-stained dirt beneath her. His fury mounted and swirled like a hurricane inside him, growing darker and more dangerous by the second, too powerful to contain despite the strength of his will. The thought of what this goddess had done, how long she had been in his service before she had betrayed him and had turned on her own family and his, and how close she had come to ending him with a poisoned blade, had his temper snapping the tethers holding it in place. He reached his gauntleted right hand out towards her before he could stop himself. Hades stretched his black talons outwards, opening his fist, and then slowly closed it as he glared down at Eris. On her next ragged inhale, she wheezed and then choked, and he stood still and silent as he gradually closed his fist further, savoring how the scent of her panic cut through the coppery stench of her blood, and she frantically clawed at her throat and clutched at the ground. Her head lifted, desperate and agonized amber eyes seeking his. Hades only closed his fist tighter, squeezing her throat without even touching her, reminding her that in this world, his power was absolute and unmatched. Her face reddened, her frantic gasps like music to his ears, a melody that entranced him and had him sinking deeper into the waiting darkness. Shadows swirled around the soles of his boots, tendrils of black rising up the metal plates of his greaves to twine around his leg and stroke it as he gave himself over to the cold abyss, listening to the coaxing whispers of the other side as it beckoned him, tempting him into surrendering to it. Hades stared down into her wide amber eyes, the world around him falling away as ice filled the space in his chest, chilling his heart until he felt nothing. When the last frail threads of warmth slipped away from him, losing their hold on him, he snapped himself back from the edge with a low, furious growl and released his hold on Eris. She sank onto her side, gasping for air, choking, coughing. Damn him. Hades stared at his fist now, Eris going out of focus beyond it, and curled his pointed black talons until they were in danger of piercing his palm. He was stronger than this, stronger than the darkness that ran in his blood, in his soul. Gradually that darkness lost its hold on him, the light that struggled to bathe his soul driving it back. As it weakened, the world returned to him, awareness of it slowly building until he once again heard the distant clamor of the occupants of the spiraling cells that drilled deep into the black earth of the underworld. Until he grew conscious of the male now watching him carefully, silently. Hades ignored him and focused on strengthening his connection to the light, using it to drive out the darkness. It was growing harder to keep it at bay. His regular visits to Tartarus weren't helping him there. The occupants of the cells were always rowdy whenever he visited, the hordes of demons and other creatures contained in the depths howling because of his presence, filling the air with rage that burned in his blood too. Their disquiet roused the fell beasts that stalked the prison, dark things that would eat his prisoners if it wasn't for the ancient metal bars that kept those in the upper reaches safe from harm. Hades let their malice seep into him as he calmly lowered his right hand and focused on Eris. The soul light caught on the beads of sweat that clung to her grimy forehead as she coughed up blood, and her hand trembled as she lifted it and tentatively brushed her fingers across her throat. It bore a black bruise in the shape of his hand, one that was darkest where his fingertips would have been if he had gripped her physically rather than mentally. Her dark eyebrows furrowed as she angled her head back, fear flitting across her features as she shifted her gaze to the other occupant of the room, one who loomed deep in the shadows, close to the heavy iron door.
"Mercy,"
she whispered, her voice scratchy, and reached her unsteady hand out towards the male.
"Help me, brother."
Hades flicked a glance at the male. Thanatos, The towering obsidian-haired god of death remained stoic with his arms folded over his broad, bare chest, his silver eyes cold and emotionless as he stared at his younger sister, and his black wings furrowed tightly so the longest feathers brushed the ankles of the onyx armor that protected him from the waist down. The male hadn't moved since the guards brought Eris into the chamber. He hadn't spoken a word either. Hades knew why Thanatos was there, and it wasn't because he felt a need to protect his sister, or because he had any mercy to show her. This was a form of punishment for himself, carried out to assuage his guilt over the fact that several of his own bloodline were involved in the uprising that threatened to destroy the Underworld and the mortal realm too. An uprising that would see the two merged into a new realm her cohorts would rule if Hades failed to stop them. All led by a goddess of the underworld, one of his own subordinates, a female he had believed to be even more loyal to him than Eris, a female he had once shown mercy. Mnemosyne. The Titaness had been spared after the Titanomachy, the war in which Hades and his brothers, Zeus and Poseidon, had risen up against their father and the other Titans to tear them down and take their place as rulers of this world. Hades had given her a new life and a new purpose in this realm, while her male counterparts rotted in Tartarus, and she had repaid that kindness by turning on him. They should have locked all the Titans away, both male and female, rather than being merciful to some, being weak. Mnemosyne had exploited that weakness, using her freedom to plot, plan, and gather herself an army, turning his own people against him and poisoning them with promises of realms to rule if they succeeded in tearing Hades down. She had even managed to evade suspicion by being incarcerated in Tartarus for a minor crime at the time Callistos and Calendria had been captured. When her term had ended a century or so later, he had turned her out into his realm and allowed her to go on her way. Anger blasted through him, heating his blood, but his mask of ice remained, hiding the sudden surge of emotion from Eris and Thanatos. He would find the Titaness, and when he did, she would pay. In the wake of anger came the familiar restlessness, impatience that had been slowly gnawing at his sanity for months now, since the demigoddess had revealed Mnemosyne's role in the uprising, and he had begun to scour the underworld for her. She had gone to ground, and she had covered her tracks well. His legions were searching every corner of his realm for her, and his sons were doing the same in the mortal world. Even Enya, his eldest son's beloved, was seeking Mnemosyne, checking every corner of Olympus for the traitor. Eventually Hades would find her, but it weighed on him. Every second she remained beyond his grasp was a second she could launch an attack, a moment in which she might succeed in her plan. And the longer she evaded him, the stronger she would become. He had no doubt in his mind that the Titaness was raising a new army for herself, replacing the soldiers she had lost as she formulated a new plan. Hades narrowed his eyes on Eris as she realized she would receive no help from her brother, and her bleak amber gaze drifted back to him. As he stared into her eyes, the weight on his shoulders became crushing. It squeezed the air from his lungs and tightened his chest until he was close to gasping for air as she had been. He needed to end this, now, before it was too late, before something terrible happened. He was God King of the Underworld, responsible for his realm and all in it, and the crown he wore had always felt heavy, but never as heavy as it did now. So many of his sons had fallen in love with mortals, or carriers, humans with blood of his realm in their lineage, and he felt responsible for the fate of that world too now. If he couldn't stop Mnemosyne, all would be lost, and his family would face a terrible fate. He couldn't stop his gaze from shifting to his left, to Thanatos. If the Titaness won, even the god of death wouldn't be spared to carry out his duty of severing the threads of life from Hades and his family now that the male was wed to Hades' daughter, Calendria. For the first time since the grim male had stepped foot into the room, a flicker of emotion colored his irises, lighting them with ethereal blue. Thanatos knew his thoughts, knew the darkness that tormented him. He could see it in that blue shimmer. Thanatos knew it because it tormented him too, probably stole sleep from him as it did Hades. Did Thanatos lay awake to watch over his beloved, fearing this glimpse of her might be his last and too afraid to tear his gaze away? Hades did. The thought of losing Persephone tore at his soul, bathing it in darkness, and he curled his fingers into fists at his sides. He stared at Eris, seeing Mnemosyne in her place as she choked and began clawing at her throat again, her eyes wild as they sought her brother, seeking help where she would find none. Mnemosyne would know the full extent of his wrath when he got his hands on her. For every betrayal she had wrought, she would receive 1,000,000 lashes from his shadows. For every member of his family, she would receive 1,000,000 more. He would whip her until she had no more blood to give, until she teetered on the brink of death. And once she was there, desperate and pleading with him in the way Eris beseeched her brother, he would let her heal and do it all over again, and again, until he ripped the last shreds of her sanity from her. And then he would discard her in the deepest pit of Tartarus and let her rot. Her new home would be a cell that Cassandra, his son Diamond's wife, was helping him construct. One that would be strong enough to contain the Titaness thanks to a combination of Cassandra's magic and his wards. Hades wanted to kill her for what she had done, but again, he was no fool. Killing a Titan was nigh on impossible. It was the reason Tartarus was home to so many of her breed. After the Titanomachy, they had tried to kill the Titans, but found they didn't possess the power to do it. So Hades had built Tartarus and imprisoned them here forever instead. The cell he was constructing was powerful, and once Mnemosyne was sealed inside it, not even he would be able to open it. It was the best he could do. Mnemosyne would be powerless and isolated, left in darkness for the rest of her years. Eris spat blood that came dangerously close to hitting his boots. Hades' blue eyes shifted from it to her and narrowed. Despite the rage that scalded his veins, the hunger to lash and rip into her for her insolence, his deep voice was calm as he spoke. "Tell me of Mnemosyne's plan." He had given up trying to get her to divulge Mnemosyne's location when she had endured a week of torture that had seen her lose several of her organs and have to regrow them. And she still hadn't told him where the Titaness was hiding. The little goddess of strife didn't know. Mnemosyne had been wise to keep her hiding places to herself, always meeting her subordinates in locations they knew, coming to them instead of allowing them to come to her. But just because Eris didn't know where the Titaness was, didn't mean she was of no use to him. Rather than getting her to tell him where Mnemosyne was, he had changed tack and started questioning her about what they had planned together.
I told you,
Eris huffed, causing a tangled thread of her black hair to sway away from her face.
I told you everything.
Hades stepped forwards to loom over her, and the shadows crept forwards too, dancing at the edge of the weak beam of light that shone down on her. It flickered, and she cast worried glances at the shadows as they eagerly inched towards her. He came close to snorting, as if the light was protecting her from them. Foolish female. If he wanted to rip her apart with his shadows, no amount of light could stop him. "You told me nothing," he said, his tone even and emotionless. She glanced from the shadows to his face and back again, and her hands shifted to her knees, her blackened fingertips digging into their bare flesh as she struggled to sit up straight. She tilted her chin up, a pathetic show of strength that didn't mask her fear in the way she believed it did. One of his shadows snapped at her right knee, and she jerked to her left, leaning her body away from it and curling her arms protectively over her chest, giving away her fear. He made the shadow settle again and waited for her to look at him. When she did, he flatly said, "Tell me of their plan."
The information is worth nothing. The plan would have changed.
His brows drew down and his lips flattened, and this time she eased backwards away from him. "Then you can tell me, for, as you say, the information is worth nothing. But it might contain a clue that would allow him to turn the tide of this war in his favor and end it before it really began." Eris flicked another look at her brother and lingered for a moment, a war erupting in her amber irises. She was considering telling him, weighing up the pros and cons. Was he finally getting somewhere? Her gaze roamed back to him.
"I have nothing to tell you."
Hades lunged towards her and bared his fangs as rage drenched his vision in crimson. Shadows burst from the soles of his feet, surging towards Eris as she shrieked and reared back, and the ground beneath him cracked, jagged fractures splintering outwards from beneath him. They flared orange, flooding with boiling lava that swiftly filled every fault line that streaked across the trembling black rock. Eris scrambled backwards as two fissures closed in on her, unleashed an ear-splitting cry as one touched her, and the scent of burning flesh filled the thick air. Hades raised his hand and closed his fist so tightly that Eris's eyes bulged and blood burst from her lips. He hauled her off the ground without touching her, his eyes slowly narrowing on her as his shadows hungrily snapped at her. The fissure that had scalded her leg split wide open beneath her, and she frantically flailed, her bare feet kicking as her gaze edged downwards. As shadows rose to drag her into the bubbling, hissing pool of molten rock. "Perhaps you should take a break, my god king. The legions may have discovered something and wish to report it." Thanatos' deep voice rolled through the room like a calming wave. Hades' attention snapped to him. The shadows instantly ceased moving towards Eris's ankles as awareness of what he had done hit him. Too close. He swept his hand to his right, discarding her, and she struck the rough wall and hit the ground on her side. She remained there, breathing hard, each desperate gasp grating in his ears. "Allow me to take over questioning Eris, my god king." Thanatos stepped forwards and then stopped dead, his glowing blue gaze snagging on one of the fissures in front of Hades' boots. Hades looked down, not snagging on one of the fissures. A green vine grew from the cooling lava, a bud forming at its tip. Leaves unfurled, stretching towards him rather than the slender light, as if he was the source of their nourishment and life. And then the bud opened. A red rose that bloomed for him. So delicate and beautiful. Too delicate to belong in this grim world he ruled. Hades stared at it, calm suffusing him, and felt to the very depth of his wretched soul that it was too delicate, that this war would finally crush that sweet flower which brought him light and balance, who made his life worth living. An ache grew inside him, an ache to see her, to dip his head to her shoulder as he crushed her to his chest and breathed in her subtle fragrance of lilies, to find his strength in her as he had so many times before. "I will question the demigoddess too." Thanatos broke into his thoughts, and Hades focused on him again. He caught the guilt that flared in the god of death's eyes. Again, Thanatos felt deeply responsible for something. Two things, in fact. One, that he had spawned the necromancer breed from his forced union with the demigoddess in question, Harlina, when he was her captive, a breed that played a part in the current uprising. too, that one of that breed had taken Hades' twins captive and had faked Calendria's death, causing her brother Callistos to suffer brutally in a way he had never recovered from. Harlina had then imprisoned Calendria, and a demon able to construct illusions had made Hades and his family believe the body they had buried in the Elysian fields had been hers, a ploy by his enemy to weaken them and drive Callistos to kill himself. That had failed, just as Hades had failed Calendria. He couldn't hold Thanatos' gaze, was looking at the crimson rose again before he could get control of himself as familiar guilt filled him. He should have known she was alive. He should have found her sooner. The thought that she had suffered so many centuries alone, believing her own family had betrayed her and left her to rot in that cage, and that her beloved brother was dead, cut a piece of his heart from him each day, slowly chipping away at it. The thought that she might have gone on suffering like that if his eldest son, Eris, hadn't stepped too close to the veil during a foolish dive into the mind of an enemy and had seen her as a grown woman, discovering she was alive. Hades couldn't bear thinking about it. Thanatos stepped closer, and Hades didn't need to look at him to feel the silent offer of support the god extended to him, and knew he didn't need to look at Thanatos to show him that he would be eternally grateful to him for his role in finding Calendria and bringing her home. Hades still wasn't fully on board with their relationship, but he had watched Thanatos and Calendria together, and it was clear that his daughter adored the dark god, and that Thanatos adored her too, would do anything for her, needed her as if she was the very heart in his chest, the thing that gave him life. The rose's petals opened further, blooming brighter, for him. Because Persephone had felt his rage and his agitation, and she was trying to calm him in the only way she could while they were apart. And by the gods, he loved her for that. He loved her for all the time she had pulled him back from the brink, for all the time she had wrapped her arms around him and crushed him to her chest, and her lips had brushed his ear as she had whispered that she loved him. Him, a fiend who had stolen her from a world filled with light and color and plunged her into one of darkness, where she should have withered and faded, wilting as any other female would have. But not his Persephone. She had bloomed, becoming a ray of light and a streak of color he had come to crave, had grown addicted to, and now couldn't live without. Eris's gaze seared the side of his face. He slid a look at her and bared his fangs when he caught her expression. It wasn't shocked or sympathetic. It was knowing, conniving. He had let the mask of ice slip and revealed his turbulent emotions to her, and now she was aware of his weakness and saw it as a source of hope. Hades decided to crush it again. "Deal with her," he growled and spun on his heel, his crimson cloak swirling outwards as he pivoted to face the door and stalked towards it. "I want to hear her screams from my palace." Not that he would be listening. He needed to see Persephone. The second he was beyond the boundaries of Tartarus, a black veil stretching around him and cragged peaks piercing the turbulent crimson sky, he focused and teleported, landed in the grounds of his home. He stared at the long, elegant black stone palace that was almost Georgian in appearance, with rows of windows set between half columns and a low-pitched roof hidden behind a balustrade that ran the length of the building. In the central third of the facade, full columns supported a triangular pediment. It had been a gift to Persephone after she had seen one like it in England and had come home prattling excitedly about modern architecture. He had wanted to make her happy, so the design and construction of their new home had started immediately. He always wanted to make her happy. Her smile was a light that brightened the darkest reaches of his heart. Hades swept his gaze over the palace and the colorful gardens she had created, and the other mansions that occupied the grounds, the homes of his children, and then the ancient black Grecian temples behind him, a feeling building inside him, growing stronger and stronger. Every second of every day he failed to find and put a stop to Mnemosyne. This home his family shared, the smile that lit up his world, the children that meant more to him than they would ever know, all of it would cease to exist if he didn't act soon. Time was running out.
Chapter 2. Persephone hurried from room to room in the palace, checking every one she passed, even though she knew she wouldn't find who she was looking for in the mixture of dark salons and studies and the odd, more brightly colored drawing room. Hades. She needed to see him. That need had been building all day. No, it had been building before that. He had been troubled and distant when he had returned to her yesterday, after she had reached out to him because she had felt the darkness rising within him. And he had held her for close to an hour, unmoving, unspeaking. He had stormed right up to her in their chambers and had swept her into his arms and just held her. She curled her hand into a fist and tucked it close to her heart, so the dark green layers of her strapless dress brushed her wrist, the warmth she had felt in his embrace giving way to a chill that numbed her. Something was wrong. Hades had been troubled from the moment this war had begun, but he had never been so distant. When he had released her, he had dropped a kiss on her brow and muttered something about needing to speak with the legions. And then he had left. He hadn't come home until she had been sound asleep. She had felt him slide into the bed behind her, had been briefly aware of the press of his lips on her shoulder and the comforting weight of his arm around her waist as he drew her back against him before sleep had claimed her again. When she had awoken, he had been gone again. She could count the number of hours she had seen him this week on one hand, and she didn't like it. The only time Hades distanced himself like this was when he was trying to shield his heart to spare it pain. Coupled with his darkening mood, she worried that something was dreadfully wrong, and he knew something he didn't want to tell her or their family. She feared they were destined to lose this battle, and everything with it. Persephone paused in the middle of a long black gallery, the hems of the layers of her dress flowing around her ankles to settle over her bare feet. She steeled her heart. They weren't going to lose. No one could defeat her husband. No one would take her family from her. She would make sure of it. Brambles erupted from the ground beneath the soles of her feet, and she clenched her fists so hard that her nails dug into her palms, and vicious thorns burst from the twining black vines spreading outwards from her. No one would take everyone she loved from her. She wouldn't let them. Her sharp rise in anger had an equally as sharp decline as she thought about what it would be like to lose Hades. She had feared that happening from the moment she had set eyes on him, all those centuries ago. She should have feared the dark male who had loomed in the shadows of the trees, watching her. But instead, she had been arrested by him, bewitched. Persephone's green gaze darted to the windows to her right, and she stared at the largest of the obsidian Grecian temples, the one dedicated to Hades. She needed to see him. Her focus shifted, the world beyond the window going blurry as her reflection sharpened. She stared into her eyes, at the scarlet waves that tumbled around her shoulders, at a face that hadn't aged a day in all the time she had belonged to Hades, body and soul. That soul had changed in their centuries together, the weight it bore growing heavier with each new addition to their family, and each threat to them. Now, she felt close to breaking under it. The brambles around her wilted and faded away, and she shored up her defenses, trying to drive the chill from her blood, refusing to let this break her. Her family would be fine. Hades would be fine. She kept telling herself that, but it didn't calm her need to see him and see with her own eyes that he was all right. She eased to a crouch and pressed her palm to the wooden floor and closed her eyes. She reached down through the timber and stone of the palace to the earth and inhaled slowly as she connected with it, focusing her mind. Her power expanded outwards in a ring, touching everything it passed beneath and telling her of it. The guards milling around at the exit of the mansion, her son Aries and his wife Megan, where they walk the orchard with Calendria in tow. The citizens of the Underworld, where they place tributes to Hades in the temple, seeking some kind of comfort from their god-king in these turbulent times. She moved beyond the boundaries of the palace in the valley, shifting her focus so her power flowed along one course, heading for Tartarus. When it reached the prison and swept down into the abyss along the spiral staircase, she felt the oily darkness of its occupants, their seething rage, their unspent anger, their desolation, their hope. She wanted to growl as her husband could at that. The prisoners of Tartarus dared to hope, and she knew why. Rumors were circulating the underworld and had no doubt reached them, and now they believed Mnemosyne would free them so they could have their revenge against Hades. It wasn't going to happen. Tartarus was a fortress, with a legion of 1,000 men posted there at all times. No one could escape it. No one had, in as long as she had been the queen of the underworld. She almost scoffed. Let them hope. They would soon learn the error of their ways. When this war was done and Hades was the victor, that hope they held would turn to despair again. Persephone severed the connection with the earth and drew her hand back, not liking the path of her thoughts. When had her own mood grown so dark? She looked at her hand and then pushed to her feet and glanced out of the window towards the orchard. Her gaze landed on Aries, where he stood beneath one of the apple trees, appearing like a shadow in his all-black attire. But even from this distance, she knew the love and warmth that would be in his rich brown eyes as he gazed at his wife. She placed her hand to the floor and focused on him to prove herself right, savoring the comforting feel of his strength and his love and how calm he was. He was how she should be, allowing dark thoughts to color her mood, to banish the light and warmth from her, wouldn't help matters. It would only make them worse. Hades needed her to be calm in the face of this storm, to weather it and endure without losing hope. He needed her to be strong. Everyone in this realm did, including her children. If she let the darkness take her, then it would take Hades too. She wasn't sure the underworld would be able to weather a storm of that magnitude. Already the landscape was changing with Hades' mood, and the sky had been a constant swirl of crimson for the last few weeks. Unrest was spreading across the land too, keeping the legions busy. Hades' mood affected everything in this realm, because the two of them were tied by deep roots, bound together until they were almost one. The evidence of that rose in the distance, beyond the palace grounds, a great jagged onyx mountain that spewed fire and ash, the face of which was scarred with glowing orange rivers of lava. It hadn't been there last week, and it hadn't erupted before this morning. Shortly after Hades had left for Tartarus with Eris, their eldest son, the quake had woken her and had sent Megan flying from her bed according to her second eldest son, Aries. His mood had been dark when she had come across him in the parlor, his anger directed at his father. She could understand why. Hades had given every one of his children his protective streak, Aries had grumbled something and had taken off, scrubbing his hand through his wild tawny hair, pulling threads of it loose from the leather band that secured it at the back of his head. There had been fire in her son's eyes. She wasn't surprised to see him coddling Megan and their infant daughter in the orchard now, doting on them both with loving smiles and tender gestures. Aries would move mountains to keep his wife and daughter safe and happy. Persephone feared he might have to do just that. They all might, if they were going to survive this. She sighed and reached through the earth again, seeking Hades, and still unable to find him. He wasn't at Tartarus, and he hadn't returned yet. Where had he gone? Perhaps Aries would know the answer to that question. She gathered her skirts and hurried along the corridor, heading downwards when she reached the vestibule and straight out of the door. She slowed then, acting with some decorum in case the guards were watching. It wouldn't do to appear harried. Word would spread to the other guards and then to the rest of the population of the Underworld. Her family, and her in particular, needed to appear as if everything was in hand and they were confident this threat would be eliminated soon. Hades wasn't doing such a good job of keeping up appearances. The new volcano was testament to that. She would have been as frustrated as her husband if she had been in his shoes, though. He questioned Eris daily, and each day she refused to tell him anything useful, no matter what he did to her. Persephone was no fool. She was not blind. She knew Hades, Thanatos, and even Eris had been torturing the goddess, and while she knew it was necessary, the thought of her husband and her son harming another like that turned her stomach. Not because she was a goddess of life, but because she knew the toll it was taking on them, even when they tried to hide it from her. Hades had a fragile hold on his darker side right now. That part of his nature he battled daily to keep under control was rising to the fore again. And she worried that this routine was affecting Eris in the same way, giving the darkness a firmer hold over him. She had spoken at length about it to Enya, Eris's wife, and the Olympian goddess of war had promised to watch over Eris and ensure he didn't lose himself to his darker side. When Persephone had caught the concern in Enya's steady gaze, she had sworn she would do the same with Hades in return. Enya was as perceptive as the man she had married, and knew Hades was struggling with the darkness himself. Persephone had been right. Enya was perfect for Eris. She always had been. She resisted the temptation to roll her eyes as she crossed the broad path and cut through the garden towards the orchard. It was too late now to regret not pushing the two of them together sooner, so they would realize the same thing she had quicker. They had been made for each other. She pushed aside thoughts of how many grandchildren she might have had by now and focused on the one she did have. Adora gurgled in her mother's arms, lifted her hands and caught Megan's long brown hair in her tiny fist, and yanked. Ouch! Megan bit out as her head jerked towards Adora, and a scowl darkened her delicate features when the infant only smiled and gurgled more happily in response. As if sensing the grin slowly working its way onto his lips, Megan slid her husband a warning look, and then held the babe out to him. You see how you like it. She has your strength. You should suffer because of it. Aries' smile faded before it really appeared, and he swept the child into his thickly muscled arms and cradled her against his broad chest. Adora was a shock of scarlet, cream, and pink against his black t-shirt and tan skin, completely at odds with him, and Persephone almost smiled at how she ruined his unyielding and lethal warrior appearance. She did smile when her son bent his head towards Adora and made a silly face, causing the babe to erupt in giggles. Beside him, Megan huffed. Ah, it's not your fault, sweetheart. Aries held the child in one arm and slung the other around his wife's slender shoulders, tugging her into his embrace too. The 10-inch difference in their height meant Megan's head landed against his chest. He grinned down at her as she angled her head back to scowl at him. No real malice behind her death look. Just the perils of being the one who is around the most. She's bound to act out with you rather than me. Megan's lips flattened. Maybe I should be in the field, and you... She cut herself off when Aries' expression lost all warmth, growing deadly serious. She sighed and toyed with Adora's toes. I know. No need to give me that look. The same look Hades had given Persephone far too many times. One that said he would never let her place herself at risk when he could keep her protected instead. Persephone adored Hades for being so protective, but it was stifling at times. The look Megan wore said she felt Aries' overbearing protectiveness was stifling too. Another thing Persephone could understand. She also wanted to be included in this war, helping where she could rather than being forced to remain on the sidelines. Aries was as stubborn as his father, though, despite Megan's ability to heal, a skill that could prove useful on the battlefield. He refused to let her leave the palace grounds. Megan's eyes brightened as she noticed Persephone approaching. Aries frowned at her reaction and then twisted slightly and looked over his shoulder, and the same light entered his eyes. Mother. Calendria turned sky-blue eyes on her, and that familiar pang lanced Persephone's chest all over again as she looked at her only daughter. Persephone held a hand out to her, and as she expected, Calendria tucked hers behind her back rather than taking it. The supple black leather gloves that covered her from her fingertips to her elbows would prevent Calendria's touch from harming anyone, but she still didn't believe it, even when Persephone could see the pain denying herself physical contact with her family caused her. Calendria's smile was small when she realized what she had done, an apologetic light entering her eyes as she met Persephone's again. Her daughter didn't need to apologize. She could only imagine the mental torment of having a gift that felt more like a curse, one that kept her from touching others. Besides, Thanatos, that was. The pain flared in Calendria's gaze again when she glanced at Adora, laced with longing that had Persephone inching a step closer to her, wanting to comfort her. One day, she would be brave enough to touch the child, and she would see nothing bad would happen. Calendria toyed with the decorative lacing on the front of her black underbust corset, an item of clothing that Persephone found as intriguing as many of the modern outfits her sons and daughters-in-law wore. She also found the fact that many of her daughters-in-law and her daughter refused to wear skirts or dresses fascinating and a little strange, but she was coming to learn all the terms for the clothing they wore, such as blue jeans and woolen sweaters, which were Megan's favorites, together with footwear she called sneakers. The shoes didn't seem very sneaky. Often, Persephone could hear Megan coming from a distance in the palace, her footwear squeaking on the marble floor of the ground level. Rather than the sky-blue dresses she remembered Calendria in as a child, her daughter now preferred to wear soft black leather trousers and her corset, paired with knee-high boots in matching leather, and a thick black cotton top beneath her corset that scooped low across her chest and had capped sleeves. It made her look like a warrioress, and Persephone had never been more proud. Her daughter had grown up strong and fierce as any of her brothers. Thanatos took that moment to appear only a few feet behind Calendria. The towering onyx-haired male furled his black feathered wings against his bare back and strode towards Calendria. He swept her up into his arms, catching her off guard, and her shriek cut off as he turned her to face him. Her whole face lit up, and by the gods, it was good to see. She wished her daughter would smile at her that way. Perhaps one day. "Did you miss me?" Calendria asked as Thanatos tucked a strand of spun gold behind her ear, and then feathered his fingers across her nape and closed his hand over it in a possessive way. In answer to that question, Thanatos gripped her nape and kissed her hard, deep, with the same passion that burned within Hades. It roused an ache in Persephone, strengthening her need to see him, and she couldn't hold back her sigh. Thanatos tensed and broke the kiss, threw her a look that revealed his surprise to see her, and quickly set her daughter away from him. Calendria laughed and didn't let him shirk her. She wrapped her arms around one of his and settled her head against his biceps. The god of death cleared his throat, awkwardly. "Must I remind you I was in favor of your relationship?" Persephone said, her tone as light and teasing as Calendria's had been. Thanatos rolled his broad bare shoulders, shifting his wings. "You are not so uncomfortable around Hades." Persephone caught the flicker of something in his eyes that said he was more uncomfortable being close to Calendria when he was around her father, not less. She waved him away and sighed. "Hades will realize how perfect you are for one another before long. You must grant him some time, since he only just got his daughter back." The words were said with a lightness that immediately transformed into a heavy sensation within her as they left her lips. She looked at Calendria and wanted to reach for her again when her daughter's fair eyebrows knitted and hurt welled in her eyes. Thanatos chased it away for her by wrapping his arms around Calendria, pinning her to his side and gazing at her with so much love in his silver eyes that Persephone felt jealous. She couldn't remember the last time Hades had looked at her like that, and she was beginning to fear he never would again. Chapter 3. Persephone pushed away from and turned her back on her grim thoughts, refusing to allow the poisonous fears and doubts to cloud her mind and make her believe they were destined to lose this war. To rid herself of them, she focused on her family, shutting out the world around them to give herself a moment's respite. The new additions to their family had only made it more wonderful to her. Her sons were all madly in love with incredible women, and her daughter had fallen for one of the most powerful gods in the Underworld. She couldn't have asked for a better match for Calendria, or for any of her sons either. If Aries made Megan look small, then Thanatos dwarfed Calendria. The 7'2" god loomed a good 15 inches over her, and even stood 4 inches taller than Hades. Her lips curled as she remembered how irritated Hades had been when Thanatos had grown taller than he was, and how he had leveled a dark look on Persephone when she had mentioned that it wasn't only Thanatos who was taller. His twin Hypnos was too. Her smile became a full-blown grin, and her cheeks flushed as she recalled how fiercely Hades had taken her that night, staking a claim on her that had seen them still making love when dawn had come. "Mother," Aries' disgruntled voice broke into her thoughts, scattering them. He looked appalled, possibly disgusted. She flushed all over again when she noticed the way vines had sprung from the black earth to snake up her legs toward the apex of her thighs, slipping between the layers of her green dress, and pretended she hadn't seen them. "Have you seen your father?" she said, her voice even, without a trace of the embarrassment she was feeling in it. Aries grunted. "Clearly, you need to see him." Thanatos shook his head. The picture of a gentleman, as he too pretended he hadn't seen what had happened. "I have not seen my god-king this day. Is he not at Tartarus?" She silently thanked him for his diplomacy as her cheeks cooled. "No, I cannot feel him there." Aries slid her a look, one she caught the meaning behind. She almost scowled at him. She hated that she felt compelled to constantly keep tabs on Hades, as Aries put it in his mortal vernacular. but she was worried about him and feared he was vulnerable when alone. The enemy wanted to open a gate between this realm and the mortal world, and then force it to remain open, allowing the two realms to bleed together and form a new one. The easiest way to do that, now their sons had closed all but one of the permanent gates, was to use Hades's blood. His blood had the power to create a gate. The enemy had gotten hold of it and come dangerously close to opening a gate with it in the past. They had also come dangerously close to killing him, which meant it was perfectly reasonable for her to be concerned when she couldn't sense him. She hadn't been able to sense Calendria in all the centuries she had been a captive of their enemy after all. What if Hades was now their captive too? Her hand drifted to her stomach as the coldness inside her began to spread again. The warmth she had felt from being around her family giving way to it as fear and doubt began to creep into her mind. She hated that feeling. They had faced danger before. This wasn't the first attempt to destroy their family. But everything felt so much more uncertain this time, and she couldn't shake the feeling that they wouldn't make it through, that the unthinkable would happen. Persephone looked at her children and thought about the members of her family who weren't there with her. Her heart clenched, and she struggled to get air into her lungs, the thought that they might be taken from her. She just couldn't. It hit her that was what was different this time. She had such a large, wonderful family now, and she feared she would lose them all, that she would lose Hades. Persephone steeled her heart again. Her children were all warriors, gods, and no one in the underworld was as powerful as Hades. They could win this, survive this. The chill remained. Aries handed Adora to Megan and took a step towards Persephone, his dark eyebrows furrowing and his deep brown eyes flooding with concern as he placed a hand on her shoulder. The weight of it felt good, and his strong grip calmed her, together with his words. "Father is with Eris. They'll be fine, Mother." She swallowed and tried to nod, tried to cling to the hope his words gave her. But it flitted away before she could take hold of it, and she shook her head, her face crumpling as she met his gaze. "I can locate Eris. He returned to his palace, and that prompted me to look for Hades." Megan bounced Adora in her arms. "Maybe he had other business that needed his attention. Maybe he went to speak with the legions." "I suppose that could be the case." Persephone felt a burst of hope, and this time was quicker to grasp it and hold on to it. "Some of the legions are posted far away. Too far for me to sense Hades if he was there. Not without expending the kind of energy that would have her needing to rest for a day to recover her strength." She pasted on a smile when everyone looked worried, even Thanatos. It faded a moment later as something dawned on her. Hades was troubled, worried, which meant there was one place he might have gone. She should have thought of it sooner. The changes to the underworld would have made clear how troubled he was, even if she hadn't known him as well as she did and could see beyond his calm facade. They were small right now. The new volcano. The fact the mountain behind the palace was more unsettled than usual. How turbulent the river that separated the palace grounds from that mountain was. The realm was responding to Hades's mood, and she had been doing her best to calm him. But it was difficult. He often didn't come to bed, and she was beginning to suspect he was avoiding her for some reason. Because the darker side of his nature was emerging again. He hid that from her, but she had seen it, felt it. Try as he might to pretend he was fine, he wasn't, and that was why he was avoiding her. He didn't want her to know how bad things were. He was trying to protect her, both from this war and from himself. Foolish male. They were husband and wife, partners, a team. He didn't have to hide things from her and bear the burden alone. He could share it with her, and she wouldn't balk. She wouldn't run. She would stand strong beside him and be all he needed her to be. Hadn't she shown him that 1,000 times? She wasn't afraid of his darker side. She never had been. That wicked side was part of the reason she had fallen for him. And she was going to show him all over again that he didn't need to hide things from her. He never had to hide who he was. Never. She looked at Aries, and then the others. I know where he is. Persephone didn't say another word, just hitched her skirts and swiftly covered the ground between the palace gardens and a place few visited, refusing to let her eagerness to see Hades make her run there. There were too many guards stationed around the palace, and all of them would panic if they saw her sprinting towards the boundary. Hades had issued them strict instructions to ensure she remained in the palace grounds at all times. It was more than a little stifling, but she knew why he had done it. He wanted to protect her. If she had her way, she would issue the same order to him and make him obey it. As soon as she was clear of the guards and could feel no eyes on her, she increased her pace, moving from walking quickly to a run. Ahead of her loomed an imposing black wooden stable with a tiled roof. It was almost as tall as the palace. Next to it, a huge tract of land had been walled off. Land where Cerberus had lived before Heracles had stolen him, and Hades had felt the need to move his beloved pet to somewhere only he or Persephone could go. The place she was heading now. She set her sights on the mountain beyond the paddock, her focus on the large cave at the base of it. As she reached it, cool air swept around her, rushing from deep within the mountain. She didn't hesitate to run into the darkness, aware that there was nothing inside that could harm her. Her steps were sure despite the darkness that robbed her of her vision, her bare feet unerringly following a path they had trod many times. When she was deep inside the cavern, she halted and held her hands out before her, her palms facing the tunnel that continued ahead of her. The chilly air hummed with power that vibrated through her, and then a small spark of violet light burst to life, hovering 8 feet above the ground. It grew into an orb that illuminated the cave, throwing shadows into the hollows of the black rock walls. Those shadows flickered like living beings as the orb flashed and the first ring appeared, edged with glyphs that shone in hues of green and yellow. The ring of light expanded outwards, and the orb pulsed again, birthing another that filled the space between them. This one had 2 bands around it, and within it were larger symbols that shone with red and pink light. The gate continued to grow before her eyes. Another ring of glyphs, and then another forming, both in shades of purple and green and blue. And then a final ring appeared, this one crimson and blue, reminding her of Hades's eyes and how they changed with his mood. The gate stopped growing, and the rings of it rotated lazily, each one heading in the opposite direction to the previous. A gate made from her blood this time, the only one in existence. She stepped forwards, passing through the glowing rings of the great vertical disk, heading from darkness into light. Behind her, the gate closed, the power of it dimming as she continued forwards, towards a stable that mirrored the one on the other side of the portal. Only this one was made of oak beams and terracotta tiles, and the paddock was a lush green field. Around her, great snow-capped mountains rose, their tan faces spotted with pockets of green shrub. They stretched down into the valley, where the rich dirt gave life to a forest of trees. It covered most of the basin, but gave way to fields in places, long stretches of grass where Cerberus had room to run. Relief was swift to pour through Persephone to lighten the weight on her heart when she spotted the crimson cloak draped over the wooden fence of the paddock, and the discarded pieces of armor set on the grass below it. Hades, she breathed. her heart beating more steadily for the first time that day. Her husband had taken Cerberus out for a walk, something he often did when he was troubled. Persephone hurried past the stable, sure he was out there in the fields or the forest. She stilled when she heard his deep voice behind her. "I do not think Eris knows anything," Hades muttered in hushed tones and then sighed. "But what other leads do we have?" She pivoted to face the stable and smiled slowly when she spotted him standing with his bare back to her. He stroked the great black three-headed hound's front right leg, sweeping a brush down it. He murmured, "How do you get so dirty when we were only in the field?" Hades angled his head upwards, turning his noble profile to her, and all three of Cerberus's heads swiveled towards him, his ears pricking. The gargantuan wolf-like beast stood at least twice as tall as Hades, was fierce and powerful, and had torn many foes apart in the past. It was vicious towards most people, but the look in its glowing blue eyes was pure adoration as it gazed at Hades. Persephone remained very still, wanting to absorb this moment. Hades would bolt if she revealed her presence. He never had been good at showing his softer side, not even to her at times. She supposed it made sense. He ruled an entire realm and had a reputation to maintain, one that helped him keep the peace in his lands and kept his subjects loyal and obedient. For the most part, anyway. There would always be those who thought they could take his crown. She pushed those thoughts aside and focused on him instead. He wasn't a god-king as he stood there brushing Cerberus down, talking to him in hushed tones. He was a man, one who made her blood heat and pulse race. His bare back and arms were all sinful perfection, corded muscles that shifted in a delightful symphony beneath his pale skin. The black cloth trousers he still wore were tight against his firm buttocks and thighs, revealing them to her hungry eyes. And his black hair was wild and tousled around the pointed spikes of his onyx crown that rose in height from the smallest point above his temples to the largest above the line of his spine. He turned his profile to her again, his pale blue eyes fixed on his work. While he stroked Cerberus's flank, her gaze stroked the elegant line of his straight nose to his wicked lips and to the strong angle of his jaw. That heat flared hotter. His hand paused, his dark eyebrows knitting hard, and then he slowly turned his head towards her. The moment he spotted her, his hand lowered and he twisted fully to face her. "My love?" His deep voice rolled over her, concern tinging it, and his blue gaze seared her as he searched her eyes. He discarded the brush and came to her, his bare feet devouring the distance between them in only a handful of strides. Rather than waiting for her to respond, he swept her into his arms, and her hands landed against the hard muscles of his bare chest as he crushed her against him. "You feel worried. Is something wrong?" he murmured roughly into her ear. Persephone closed her eyes, wrapped her arms around his waist, and feathered her fingers along his spine, warmth curling through her. "I was worried about you." He unfurled his arms, gripped her by her upper arms, and eased her back. His blue gaze held hers, glittering with need. Not a physical desire, but an emotional one. There was that look she had been aching to see on his face, one that eclipsed the way Thanatos had gazed at Calendria. It warmed Persephone right down to her marrow, until not a trace of the cold that had plagued her the last few days remained. Whenever he looked at her like this, as if she was the center of his universe, as if she was as vital as the breath in his lungs or the beat in his chest, she fell in love with him all over again. Her beautiful, dark god. She reached her hands up and framed his face with her palms, needing to keep those eyes on hers. She couldn't remember the last time they had been alone like this, or he had let her see beyond the veil to his true feelings. His blue irises took on a troubled edge, red sparks igniting in them, and she could sense he wanted to look away from her. She held firm, not letting him. "Talk to me about it, Hades," she whispered, filling her voice with how deeply she desired that, so he would hear it as well as see it in her eyes. When she was sure he wouldn't look away, she dropped her hands to his shoulders and skimmed them down his bare arms. His skin was cool beneath her touch, and the feel of it and the contours of his firm muscles sent a shiver through her, a ripple of pleasure she tried to ignore as she focused on making him understand something. "I am part of this. I want to share this burden with you. You have been so very distant, and I don't want you to shut me out." His expression grew fierce, and she tensed as his hands were suddenly on her face, cupping her cheeks. He bent his head towards her and pressed their foreheads together and husked, "Never. I would never shut you out. I cannot. As you well know, you are my heart, Persephone, my soul." She framed his face again and leaned towards him as she closed her eyes, feeling the truth of his words. "As you are mine, Hades." He pushed her back and stared at her, emotions swirling in his eyes, flickers of warmth and light, and love that stole her breath. On a low growl, he swept her back into his arms and claimed her mouth.